The shelter worker's hands trembled as she handed over the paperwork. "This is Max, our most dangerous resident. He's attacked 3 handlers, and we've marked him as unadoptable." Emily watched the German Shepherd's intense stare from behind the cage. Despite the warnings, despite his reputation, something in those fierce eyes called to her. That evening, as she opened her front door, Max's deep growl echoed through her home. What happened next left the entire town speechless. In every small town across America, there are stories that remind us of the transformative power of love and second chances. But in this quiet community, behind the walls of an ordinary animal shelter, an extraordinary tale was about to unfold, one that would challenge everything people thought they knew about redemption. The Morton County Animal Shelter was like many others, rows of kennels filled with hopeful faces, the air alive with barking and the occasional happy yelp of a dog meeting their new family. But in the very last kennel, away from all the others, there was a dog that made even the most experienced handlers pause. His name was Max, a German shepherd with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Unlike the other dogs who would bark and wag their tails when visitors passed, Max would just watch, silent and still, his gaze following every movement with an intensity that made people hurry past his kennel. "He's been here longer than any other dog," the shelter workers would whisper among themselves. 3 handlers attacked. Even professional trainers won't work with him anymore. The bright red caution signs plastered across his kennel told only part of the story. Max had earned a reputation that seemed impossible to shake, dangerous, aggressive, beyond help. Months turned into years, and while other dogs came and went, Max remained. The shelter staff had almost given up hope of ever finding him a home. Who would want to take on such a risk? Who would look past those warning signs and see something worth saving? The answer came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when Emily Parker walked through the shelter doors. She wasn't looking for a challenge or a project, she simply wanted to adopt a dog. As she walked down the long row of kennels, stopping to greet each eager face, something drew her attention to the very end of the corridor. There, in the shadows of the last kennel, sat Max. While other dogs jumped and barked for attention, he remained perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Emily with an intensity that stopped her in her tracks. Where others saw danger, Emily saw something different, something that made her heart ache with recognition. The shelter worker who had been showing her around noticed where Emily's attention had wandered. "Oh, that's Max," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. He's not available for adoption." But Emily couldn't look away from those eyes. "Why not?" she asked, still watching Max, who hadn't moved a muscle but continued to stare back at her with that unblinking gaze. The shelter worker shifted uncomfortably. "He's dangerous. We've had multiple incidents. He's attacked 3 of our handlers, and even professional trainers have given up on him. We keep him here because, well, the alternative." But Emily wasn't listening anymore. Something about Max's steady gaze spoke to her in a way she couldn't explain. Where others saw aggression, she saw pain. Where others saw danger, she saw fear. The shelter staff tried everything to discourage her. They showed her the incident reports, explained the liability issues, brought out other dogs that would be more suitable. But Emily's mind was made up. After a week of persistent visits and lengthy discussions, she signed the adoption papers, her hands steady even as the shelter workers trembled while passing them over. That evening, as Emily opened her front door with Max on a heavy-duty leash, she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. The German shepherd's deep growl echoed through the empty house as he took in his new surroundings, his body rigid with tension. The first few days were a delicate dance of distance and caution. Max claimed a corner of the living room as his territory, his growls warning Emily whenever she came too close. She set up his food and water bowls at a safe distance, careful to give him the space he seemed to desperately need. At night, she would hear him pacing, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors. Sometimes in the darkness, she would catch glimpses of his eyes reflecting the moonlight, always watching, always alert, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. Emily tried everything she could think of. She bought the best treats, the most durable toys, read every training book she could find. But Max remained unreachable, trapped behind walls built from years of trauma and fear. He wouldn't take treats from her hand, wouldn't respond to her voice, wouldn't even acknowledge her presence unless it was with a warning growl. Weeks passed, and while the constant growling had decreased, they seemed no closer to any real breakthrough. Emily began to doubt herself. Maybe the shelter workers had been right. Maybe some dogs were too damaged, too far gone to be helped. One particularly difficult morning, after Max had spent the entire night pacing and growling at shadows, Emily made a decision. She would return to the shelter, not to give up on Max, but to understand him better. There had to be more to his story, something that would help her reach him. What she learned at the shelter that day shattered her heart into pieces. Max's previous owner had been a small-time criminal who used dogs as part of his illegal activities. Max had been kept chained outside, exposed to all weather extremes. When he wasn't aggressive enough for his owner's liking, he was starved. The final straw came when authorities found him abandoned, still chained up, after his owner fled from police. He had been left there for days without food or water. Standing in the shelter parking lot, Emily felt tears streaming down her face. The pieces were finally falling into place. Max's distrust, his constant vigilance, his inability to accept kindness. He had never known it before. She sat in her car for a long time, wrestling with what to do next. The easy thing would be to admit defeat, to bring Max back to the shelter and accept that some damage couldn't be undone. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered those eyes. Eyes that held not just fear and aggression, but a desperate longing for something more. That evening, Emily approached things differently. Instead of trying to train Max or fix him, she simply sat on the floor near his corner, reading a book. She didn't look at him, didn't try to engage him. She just existed in his space, letting him know he wasn't alone anymore. Days passed this way. Emily would sit, read, sometimes talk softly about her day, never demanding anything from Max. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. The distance between them in the room grew smaller. The growls became less frequent. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with something that looked almost like curiosity. Then came the evening that changed everything. Emily was sitting in her usual spot, exhausted after a long day at work, when she felt something different in the air. Max had left his corner and was slowly, cautiously, approaching her. Her heart pounding, Emily remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. For the first time since she'd brought him home, there was no growling, no signs of aggression, just careful, tentative steps forward. Max stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes holding hers with that same intense gaze she'd first seen at the shelter. But now, up close, she could see something else in those eyes, a question, a possibility. It seemed like they stayed that way for hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, in a moment Emily would never forget, Max lowered his head and took one more step forward, close enough that she could feel his breath on her hand. But their journey was far from over. Just as they were beginning to make progress, an incident in the backyard threatened to undo everything they'd built. A car backfired nearby, and Max's reaction was immediate and intense. In seconds, he transformed back into the dangerous dog everyone had warned about, lunging and barking with a ferocity that reminded Emily just how deep his scars ran. Yet this time, instead of feeling fear or disappointment, Emily felt something else: understanding. Max's reaction wasn't about being dangerous, it was about being terrified. His aggression wasn't a choice, it was the only way he'd learned to protect himself in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. The real breakthrough came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, several months after Max had first come home. Emily was sitting in the garden enjoying the warm sunshine when Max approached her. This time, there was no hesitation in his steps. He walked right up to her and for the first time leaned his body against her leg. With tears in her eyes, Emily slowly raised her hand. Max flinched slightly but didn't move away. When her fingers finally touched his fur, he let out a deep sigh and leaned further into her touch. It wasn't a dramatic transformation or a miracle cure. Max would always carry the scars of his past. But in that simple moment of connection, both Emily and Max found what they had been searching for: trust. Today, Max still has his moments of fear and uncertainty. Loud noises can still trigger his anxiety, and he remains wary of strangers. But he's no longer the dangerous dog from the shelter. In Emily's home, he's found safety, patience, and unconditional love, the things every living being needs to heal. Their story has become something of a legend in their small town: the dangerous dog and the woman who refused to give up on him. But Emily knows the truth is both simpler and more complex than that. It's not a story about taming a dangerous animal or performing a miracle. It's about understanding that sometimes, The most aggressive behavior comes from the deepest pain, and that healing doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small moments of trust, one day at a time. As Emily watches Max sleeping peacefully in his favorite sunny spot by the window, she thinks about that first day at the shelter, about all the people who warned her away, about how close she came to giving up. She thinks about how easy it is to label something as dangerous simply because we don't understand its pain, and she thinks about how much we miss when we don't look past those labels to see the heart underneath. Max lifts his head and meets her gaze, his eyes now soft with trust and contentment. He's not the same dog who growled from the corner all those months ago, just as Emily isn't the same person who trembled while signing those adoption papers. They've changed each other in ways neither could have imagined, proving that sometimes the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards, and that love, patience, and understanding can heal even the deepest wounds.